Thank you. Welcome everyone to a joint hearing of the committee, the House Committee on Commerce and Economic Development and the House Committee on General and Housing. And today is still February 6th, Thursday, and it is approximately 1 p.m., a little later. And we are going to jointly hear issues around tax increment financing from Joan Goldstein. Joan, hi, you are remote, okay, and Jessica Hart.
Yes.
And we have with us Ted Barnett, fiscal analyst, and John Gray. Do I understand, John, you're going to testify? Of the two of you, who goes first?
I can go first.
Okay, so, Joan, I think you know everyone on this committee, but I'm thinking Jess, I don't know you at least, and so perhaps we ought to go around very quickly and introduce ourselves. Want to start?
Tom Charlton, I represent Athens, Grafton, Chester, and Wyndham.
Joe Parsons, Newberry, Thompson, Crop.
Gail Pezzo, District 20, Colchester.
Emily Krasnow, Chittenden 9, South Burlington.
Mary Howard, Rutland City, District 6.
Ashley Bartley, Fairfax and Georgia.
Hi, I'm Mark Mahaly. I represent Calais, Plainfield, and Marshfield.
Hi, I'm Mike Marcotte, from Coventry. I represent Coventry, Irisburg, Newport Town, Troy, J. Westfield, Lowell, and Eden, and Chair of House Commons.
Hi, Dee Granning, representing Jericho and Underhill, and Vice Chair of House Commons.
I am Kirk White, I represent Bethel, Rochester, Stockbridge, and Hancock, and I'm the ranking member of House Commons.
Hi, Saudia Lamont, Lamoille, Washington District, and I am on the General and Housing Committee.
Emily Karras Duncan, I run Economic Development and Commerce, Bloomington, Whitingham, and Halifax.
Tony Nicholas on Economic Development and Commerce, representing Milton and Georgia.
Dave Bosch of Commerce and Economic Development from Clarendon, representing Wallingford, Clarendon, West Rutland, the bulk of Rutland Town.
Jonathan Tuber, Pownell, the Bennington 1 District of Reedsboro, Searsburg, Stanford.
I'm Abby Duke with House Commerce, and I represent Parkland, Burlington.
Tom Molson, House Economic Development and Commerce, representing Bristol, Lincoln, Moncton, and Starksville.
Michael Lugan, Commerce and Economic Development, and I represent Berry City.
I'm Elizabeth Burrows, and I represent Windsor 1, Heartland, West Windsor, and Windsor, and I sit on the General and Housing.
Thanks. Joan, could you state your name for the record and take it away?
Sure. Thank you very much. Joan Goldstein, Commissioner, Department of Economic Development. I'm here with Jessica Hartleben, who is actually there. If you want to introduce yourself as well, since we'll kind of be combined on this presentation.
You want to come, Jessica, if you're going to testify, why don't you come and sit down? Thank you.
So the title of our presentation is Strategic Projects for Advancing Rural Communities. We've been calling this SPARK. This is inserted into the administration's housing proposal because we thought this derivation, if you will, of TIF would be very helpful to housing generation. We go to the next slide. In this, we will review kind of how, regular TIF or tax increment and financing district is a tool that municipalities use to fund infrastructure, and they finance that infrastructure through utilizing what the future value of the new private development will be. So just to keep it as simple as possible, it's really driven by the desire for development in a community. And in many cases, there is not adequate infrastructure to accommodate that development. And so the kind of before TIF and after TIF, what it represents is what the taxable value does during that period of time. And it usually increases significantly And the incremental tax that could be collected from that is utilized to pay back the debt that the municipality went into to do that infrastructure. So that's normal TIF. Why we're differentiating this is so that we want to, and I should say, normal TIF actually involves tens or hundreds of parcels in a particular district. So it's very, very complex. And many of the larger towns and municipalities have taken advantage of it. You know, when I say larger, Winooski, St. Albans, South Burlington, Hartford, Killington has one, a new one. So these are vast TIF districts. So what this is to scale it down a bit for smaller communities. We really want smaller communities to have the tools to be able to develop the housing and the economic development that they need in order to sustain a thriving community. So our focus this year, of course, is housing, and there's housing demand all over, rural areas as well as the urban areas. So we think that this scaled down version, which would mean instead of hundreds of parcels, you may have a parcel or a project in a particular town that doesn't pencil out, which is what we've been hearing from many of the developers and builders, that the cost of construction has increased considerably and some things are not getting done. So the idea behind TIF is always that, but for the TIF, the project wouldn't get done. And so this abides by that same type of rule. And we would be addressing housing demand in these areas, as well as flood impacted communities who are having difficulty with, you know, do they really want to do federal buyouts of these flood impacted areas and then have no ability for taxable value, that these communities may want to purchase those impacted parcels, impacted properties, and do some flood mitigation efforts and flood, climate mitigation efforts. And that's expensive, but they would, if they could utilize this tool and borrow the money to do that and then pay it back with incremental tax revenue from a private development, let's say a multi-unit housing that would go on that area. So we want to address housing, we want to address flood impacted communities, and some communities still may want to use this for infrastructure, right? That's still very much a need, and boosting local economies. So more housing, economic growth, environmental resilience, and development. Now, the mechanism, again, is that, you know, a town would either go into debt. This derivation of TIF, however, gives a municipality the ability to grant that investment partner or private developer or private builder, grant them the opportunity to get the increment that's being collected to help that development happen. So again, we leave it, it's got to be municipally driven. It's not like it's going to be private development driven, but municipally driven to decide, do they need the increment to pay back infrastructure, or do they need the increment to help pay back the developer who chose to do the development in their community? So it's really giving some power back to the municipality to make that determination. And why do we think this is valuable? We've heard from communities that, for example, may not need to expand infrastructure, but they have a developer who wants to do some housing and it doesn't pencil out. So the mechanism for this would be the municipality and the developer would have to have a community agreement. The municipality is not taking risk because they're not going to pay anything until after the development is done and after the increment is being collected. So it kind of acts like a rebate of sorts. But at the very least, at the get-go, the developer would know that they would be entitled to this increment if they fulfill their end of the agreement. So Yeah, I mean, the bottom infographic is just all about how, you know, projects aren't penciling out, they can't do anything. They need an investment partner, they create a community agreement. VEPC, which is Vermont Economic Progress Council, who is the governing body, and Jessica is the executive director of VEPC. It's a board that would review the community agreement, reviews the projects, make sure that there's enough increment, make sure that this is feasible. The construction happens, the tax revenue gets collected, new homes, new community vibrancy, and grand list growth. Want to address this issue that we hear often about taking from the ed fund. So Spark, just like TIF, it only uses new incremental tax revenue. So it's money that would not have existed to begin with, so therefore cannot be taken away. The property taxes associated with the new investments made at the property is what we're calling the incremental tax revenue. This is the amount that exceeds what the property was worth pre-project. So really, if anything, it grows the education fund, but it is a long-term investment. I mean, we called it Spark. Sometimes I think it's really next generation investment. So next generation investment now, so that the next generation could benefit from this, you know, grand list growth and increment in taxable revenue that'll occur over the next 10 to 20 years, depending on the length of the debt.
We can ask it. We can ask questions. There you go. By the way, Joan, I'm gonna say, if anyone has a question, ask it, just raise your hand and ask it when you want to ask it. I don't think we should wait until the end if that's acceptable. Just.
I agree.
Yeah.
So go ahead. Do we have?
No, it's on the next slide.
Okay.
Go ahead, Joe.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Was there a question or?
Not yet.
I have one, but I'm going to just wait a minute.
Okay. So I don't know, Jessica, did you want to take on the next segment about the community agreements? It's basically the agreement between the municipality and the private investor.
Sure. So just for the record, I'm Jessica Hartleben. I'm the executive director of VEPC. I've been the executive director at VEPC for about 1 year. And prior to that, I was the staff attorney working at the Department for Economic Development on their ARPA-related projects and making sure that we were using ARPA funds properly and implementing the CRRP program and the CIP program, and then also did work with brownfields and other DED-related programs. So having said that, I'm happy to talk about the community agreements. So the community agreements are new in terms of Spark. Community agreements are not something that we have in our regular TIF program now. We consulted with the state of Maine. They use these community agreements to have municipalities and builders or other business owners that want to move into their municipalities. It's a contract that's negotiated between the municipality and either the builder or the business owner to encourage the business owner or the builder to come to their municipality. And so, for example, in Maine, if a builder wanted to move into a town, the community may say, and this is a small community, may say, we don't have the ability to bond for the infrastructure improvements that it would take to create that housing. The municipality may say, okay, you builder, you take on that risk. And when the municipality and the builder come up with that agreement, the builder says, okay, I'll take on the responsibility of building that infrastructure. and I will take on the responsibility of building the homes. Once those homes are built and that new growth is received, the home builder would basically get a rebate of the increase in their property values for a period of time that the community and the builder agreed upon. I spoke to the Maine Department of Economic Development today. They sent me a sample community agreement. It had to do with a hospitality agreement, but she said you can use these for builders, for businesses, manufacturing. They also use theirs for, they had a number of energy projects. She also gave me the website. You can see all of the TIF districts that they use in the state of Maine. Having grown up in Maine, I knew a number of the towns, and they were some of them were very small towns, less than 1,000 people. So with that, Rep. Granning, you had a question that you're just chomping at the bit to say.
And I have a couple more. But
Sure.
I'm gonna start with the first one.
Yeah.
So when I look at this program, Spark, I'm looking at how do we help our smaller towns
Yeah.
for whom it's too complicated, too much, whatever, to do a full TIF program, right? But for them to negotiate a community agreement with a business, they're still not going to be likely at even footing, right? Because you have a part-time town manager, you have volunteer select board perhaps, right? So there's this power imbalance, there's this problem that it could put the town in a place where they are way more at risk than in a more evenly balanced situation. And so I have concerns about what kind of supports we can provide as a state for that. And I just want to flag that as we're talking about developing this program, right?
Sure. Yeah, so I actually, because I've heard that question a few times in your committee and in another committee that I was listening to. And so I talked to the commissioner today about that. And what she said is that they have municipalities that have less than a few hundred people. And what they do is they have, similar to what these volunteer town clerks, things like that, you would hire an accountant to do your books. They might be able to hire an attorney to help them negotiate their agreements. That would be considered what is in regular TIF a related cost. So you could bill that back to the Spark and have that paid for. Alternatively, I know that there are other consultants that also could be of assistance. VEPSI is, we are a 2-person staff. So, I would certainly be open to hearing if there are other proposals around other types of technical assistance. I know that the RPCs and the RDCs have been supportive in the past, but in talking to the state of Maine today, they also have volunteer town clerks and town managers. And what they say is that they just contract those services out.
My other question is, if you're looking at a town that needs wastewater and housing, would it be multiple community agreements?
No. So the thought is that if the municipality chose to take on the water and wastewater, that's part of a typical TIF, and the town bonds for that. There is in the town of Middlebury.
So they would have to do both TIF and Spark?
No, not at all.
I'm trying to really.
Nope. So let's just take this. There's an example. There is a town right now that is doing something similar. The town of Middlebury received a CRRP award. They needed to do water and wastewater to create a housing development. They basically did a pass-through of their CRRP funding to the developer. The developer is doing the water and the wastewater project and the housing project. The town is giving a pass-through of that CRRP funding to the developer to do the housing project and the water and wastewater. At the completion of that, the developer will then return or sell back, if you will, the water and wastewater lines so that the town can then have that on their books and can bill, as a community would for their water and sewer. And then in addition to that, the town now has additional grand list growth because they're going to have housing, they're going to have apartments that they wouldn't have otherwise had. Mhm.
Go ahead. Just following up on the drainage question, I think in general, in terms of how applicable this program will be, or especially maybe some of the smaller towns. Middlebury, that's great. In Madison County, they're the biggest town in Madison County, and there's a bunch of other smaller towns.
Yep.
Whether there are any program criteria that might limit the application of ability of a smaller municipality to do this, or whether there'll be some ability to see as what do you say, related costs, right? Whether towns can join together to do something like that.
So I can give you another example of a town in Rutland. Fairhaven is an example of a town. They have a parcel of land where they had a developer, and Fairhaven is a town of 3,000 people. They have a parcel of land that they wanted to create housing. And here's their example. So you'll see there's a 25-acre parcel of land. It used to be an old stock car racetrack. It's been vacant for over 20 years. They had a developer 2 years ago that approached them, but the town needed to bond for, I believe at that time was $3 million to do the infrastructure to create the housing for that project. The town didn't have that ability to do that, so the project fell through. With Spark, you could approach a developer and say, you take on the infrastructure project, and the town of Fairhaven would give a rebate for a portion of the project costs if the developer took on the infrastructure and then did the improvement and did the housing. So in our example we have here, we've actually got these numbers from the town of Fairhaven, and you will see there is a 33% more value by doing this project than if the lot just remained vacant. We would also, in our example, if you look down to the feasibility, it's a $30 million construction project with a $4.8 million water, wastewater, and roads. If the developer were to take that on, once the project is completed, the annual incremental tax revenue, so that increased revenue, is about $404,000. If you were to give a 90% rebate, you would, over a 20-year period, you would give back $7.2 million, which would cover the $4.8 million in infrastructure needed to build the housing. And it would reduce the cost down to $534,000 to build the housing. So one of the other pieces that we're hearing is that it is not affordable for builders to build these homes and then sell them at costs that Vermonters can afford. So we're hoping that this will address those issues as well.
I guess I have a question. You have a question?
You actually,
Well, first of all, on what grounds would Betsy be able to turn down a project?
So Pepsi could turn down a project if Pepsi found that the project wasn't feasible. And if it didn't have, if the numbers just didn't pencil out and the incremental values wouldn't be enough to support the project.
So Pepsi would have the authority to independently review the pro forma of the project
We do now.
and determine whether the subsidy was necessary?
We do that now.
The prior slide talked about eligible costs. What does that mean?
So eligible costs are defined by, I believe, rule, TIF rule. So typically, and I don't have the whole TIF rule in front of me right now, typically eligible costs.
The same as TIF, as the TIF, current TIF,
Yes.
except it would include private costs.
It could include some private costs, right, for the development of the housing, yes.
I guess my last,
Related cost, right? You're
Related
doing
to the
a
project.
differential, it's
Exactly.
eligible.
I have a lot of experience in tax increment in another state, and I'm puzzled by one thing. I'm used to seeing tax increment projects where the tax increment goes to the infrastructure.
Yeah,
It's a public project, consequently, it's bonded for tax-free bonds.
that's right.
So the developer, when they're putting their capital stack together, they don't have to worry about the infrastructure because it's going to be taken care of right away through bonding. They don't have to put any upfront cash.
Yeah.
Isn't that a superior solution for a development than saying you have to capitalize and pay for the infrastructure and you'll get paid back when you built the whole project, which could take several years? I mean, I don't understand why a developer would prefer to take on the cost of infrastructure up front when they might not sell the houses for 5 years or 3 years, when a normal TIF would just upfront that cost.
So I think that.
Yeah, if I could just interject,
Go ahead,
it's
Jo.
not really, it's not preferred. But we're hearing that certain towns are asking the developer to take that on, and that the town would then take care of maintenance. The examples that Jessica pulled through are just examples where infrastructure was indeed part of it. The developer and the Let's Build Home Coalition is in favor of this because it's not required that they do infrastructure. That's just an example. But this could help with penciling out some of the housing projects that are being presented, that there are gaps, and that this would help fill that gap. And even though it may take years for them to build, if it's a commitment, it's a commitment that they could get that increment, provided they build the building. It's not upfront money, but it's a commitment to get funded.
It would certainly reduce the cost to the municipality and administration.
Which,
If the builder took on the responsibility of providing infrastructure.
providing the infrastructure.
Go ahead, Kurt.
Could you talk a little more about the percentage-based model adjusting to actual tax increment levels to ensure fiscal responsibility and protecting municipalities from underperforming projects? And well, I'm just imagining, always look at the worst case scenario. So the municipality comes up with a community agreement with the developer. The developer, it starts this process, gets 10% in, goes bankrupt or something like that. How does that, how would that play out to the municipality?
Well, I think
again,
that you would need, at the beginning of this, as in regular TIF, the community is doing market analysis, feasibility studies. They're penciling out all these projects. Obviously, worst case scenario, something horrible happens. In the scenario where the developer is taking on all of the risk, then the municipality is not out any money and they're not having to pay back any bond. And they're certainly not going to have to pay on any community agreement because the developer didn't follow through and finish the project. In my experience with TIF and in our TIF reporting, the 9 districts that we've had, that has not happened. And I think that's a credit to the legislature for putting in the strict standards that we have and for the monitoring oversight that VEPC provides. And that's going to continue with Spark. It's not going to be any less, but you are giving communities an opportunity to address their needs in their individual communities. And this is designed to help a community that has 500 people or a large city like Burlington or Winooski.
And if I could interject, every town has a lister, and they're usually involved in the projection of what the taxable increment would be. So it's not as if they're just taking a developer's pro forma and, rubber stamping it. Each town that has a TIF, typically the lister or the assessor will look at what is projected and then figure out what that projected incremental tax revenue would be.
Go ahead.
I guess I just wonder under the scenario where the builder upfronts everything, builder has to go out and get financing for that. And part of that financing is gonna be built on the promise of getting tax increment financing back. What happens if the builder goes bankrupt in the middle of it? Who is the bank or the financer coming after?
We're going after the builder.
Which doesn't have the money to pay it back. So if your promise, the bank is, or the financing is going on a premise that there's a promise for tax increment financing. That's one of the features of being able to get the loan.
Mm-hmm.
But if they go belly up and
there's no incremental tax to be had, then the builder's going to be on the hook for that.
So I'm just wondering if.
Isn't the bank going to insist that the community agreement, which is a recordable document, I take it?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Recordable document?
A recordable? Yes.
Well, wouldn't the bank say you're second in line?
Well, I guess that depends on the deal.
Yeah, that
Right.
would just depend on each individual deal, but my understanding in talking to the main folks today is that their community agreements are contingent on the developer actually completing the property, because really you're not going to realize those incremental values until the property is completed.
Sure, but you're still developers going and getting stacks of financing.
Yeah.
And in that, TIF is part of that stack. And so I'm just wondering who's on the hook, if anybody's on the hook, and if no one's on the hook, I don't know how they can use the TIF as part of that strategy of getting funding.
I think what I would say to that, Representative Marcotte, is that that's really for the bank and the developer to negotiate and work out. And bad things happen, and that's, as we've seen, a small percentage. The tip districts that we have, if there have been projects that haven't happened or have had to be changed due to costs in the regular TIF districts, municipalities come back to VEPC with a substantial change request, and the substantial change request addresses changes in projects and costs.
But if something happens in the middle of a project with a regular TIF, it's the full faith and credit of the municipality that's on the line. And they have taxing capacity where they can pay the bond back. Here, it's a little different. And so if I guess I'd want to hear from, I'd want to understand from the financial community how they would treat that and.
Yeah.
And, you know,
Sure.
to try to see if this can go forward or not.
Yeah.
Because if we're creating something that financial community is gonna say, that's too much of a risk, I'm not gonna go there, then we're
Well,
kind of.
maybe, yeah, and if I could interject, I mean, it might be good to talk to some of the builders to find out if they indeed would utilize community agreements as a contingency for their bank loan. Some may not need it, some do need it. I think right now what we're comparing is, right now it's the full faith and credit of the municipality that if the development doesn't happen, they still have to pay back the debt. That's a gigantic risk, right? The way it is now. Whereas here, the municipality wouldn't have to pay anything because they don't have anything to pay,
Yes.
right? There's no increment.
Right.
Yep.
I do think having a bank come in and talk about it would be helpful for this committee, because we are trying something new here.
In the example that Joan put up of the racetrack.
Yep.
Essentially, that's an example where the developer, the increment is going both to infrastructure and the development. And the portion that's going down to the development as compared with a typical tip.
Yeah.
Is being used to write down the price of the housing.
That's right.
Is that enforceable? I mean, what would keep the developer from just selling it for increasing their internal rate of return by just selling it at market rates?
So that would be something that we would, you as the legislature and us as VEPSI, we can put parameters on that, right? We could write into our rule that we want these houses to not be sold for more than X number of dollars, or a certain percentage, right? Those are the devil in the details, I think.
I think that would be a difficult detail. I think you'd get a lot of back.
Yeah, potentially.
But I'm not saying it couldn't be done.
Yeah.
Sort of trying to, and then through the conversation that is that we're not attempting to posit something that reduces risk in economic development or real estate development to zero. It is, as it always has been, a risky project with some risk. We determine, as communities will determine their appetites for it. If I understand correctly, part of the notion of Spark is that we're going to create a tool that brings the same many of the same developers who are doing work in our large communities to give them a reason to come do this work in smaller communities without having the same timeline of like, all right, you small town, do your thing first, and then we show up afterwards. That rather, I think, inciting it to the examples you have, that these are smaller projects. Perhaps there could be a little bit more of pursuing both infrastructure and real estate development sort of at the same time.
Yep.
Yes, we're understanding that correctly.
Yep.
But so this is Spark is attempting to find a way to bring what the market may be more easily able to bear out in a larger municipality into places where that work really doesn't seem to occur.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Could you clarify one thing? I don't know whether it's you or Joan. Sure. Right now, am I right that when we do a TIF, we take 70% of the ed fund amount of the increment?
Yes, that's right. That's what the current statute says with a caveat that some districts take additional. So for example, Winooski, which just closed, they were pre 2017, right? Is that when the law was changed? So they were pre that shift. So they took 100% of their increment for the life of their TIF district. But any new districts going forward, to answer your question, would be 70% to the municipality and 30% to the ed fund. The municipal tax increment is 85% to the municipality, 15%. They have to take 85% and put it towards their TIF, and then 15% can go back to the town.
And is Spark, Is Spark 100% or 80%? I just heard two different numbers here.
So we have it up to 100%. And the thought process behind that is this. If you have a smaller parcel, you have less increment, right? So you want to provide that increment, as much of the increment in a shorter potentially amount of time. So that you're not having a builder have to pay it out over a 20-year period, for example. So if you have 100% and you can meet your amount in a 10-year period, then that's 10 years at 100%. And then 100% is going to the ed fund after that time.
But the idea also, the reason why we're saying up to is we do want to give some leeway for the municipality to work that out. As we said before, I think you asked the question about would VEPSI turn it down? What happens is there's so much pre-work before it even gets to the VEPSI board. For example, there have been communities that wanted TIFs but didn't have enough projects for it to make sense. They never even got to VEPSI. So we're envisioning that same type of pre-work before we even know, right? So that by the time you get to the board, we've proven out that it's financially feasible, So again, we want to leave that leeway for the individual projects. All these different projects are going to be different. Some will need infrastructure, some will need both. Some may just mean that they have a builder and it's in a downtown, they already have the infrastructure. So we want this to be as flexible as can be with the municipality driving it.
So we're talking about small municipalities, all this upfront work that needs to be done. Those municipalities usually don't even have the funds to do that. What are we thinking about on how to get that done?
Sure. I can answer that question for you because I was working with a municipality, I met with them this fall, and they had previously looked at creating a TIF district, I think about 9 years ago. And it didn't pencil out for them. So now they're at a crossroads where they want to consider it again, but they're not sure that they have the capacity to ask their voters to pay $50,000 to do that work. There are community development funds through our partner at DHCD that can offer community planning grants. And I don't remember the total amount. I think it's, Joan, I don't know if you know, but
I think it's up to $40,000 or $50,000. So that clearly they could use that. Also,
so that would be
and VEPSI, you yourself do a fair amount of work with the community. It's not going to be a full-on study, but just a introduction to what they're planning so that we could ask the right questions and they'll know.
So in that meeting that I went to this fall, we did talk to the municipality and just kind of, in order for TIF to work, you have to have, builders and investors that are willing to do these projects so that you can create the additional funds to pay back those infrastructure bonds.
But would it be possible if there's a project that they're working with a builder or a developer, that the developer pays all upfront costs as well, that could then be reimbursed by the
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and in the case of the town that I was talking about, I mean, they may have one project of the 8 that they were thinking about. Doing an 8 project TIF is probably not going to be feasible for them, but they might be able to do one. And that would create housing in particular.
Joan, I want to signal a concern I have, which probably is obvious to you. but I'm not sure what to do about it. And any thoughts you eventually have would be appreciated. If let's say in a year, all of the projects that we're talking about add up to 100 units of money, whatever that unit might be, for beyond the municipal part. We're essentially telling the voters of the state that in addition to the taxes you pay for education, you're going to pay another 100 units to support the increment, because the increment's coming out of the ed fund. And if we adopt a model for education funding that doesn't just say whatever the voters vote, but says it's going to be X amount, well, we're going to just have to tax more than that to pay for the increment. And I'm wondering what we do about that and how we accomplish that in some way that is acceptable.
So if you could, thank you for the question and the concern. If you could indulge me a bit, take me through what you mean by other taxpayers paying the increment. I want to understand that because it's not our understanding that other taxpayers are paying the increment. If that were the case, we would never hear that the TIF takes from the ed fund, right? Because if people were paying that, then it wouldn't be taking. So I need to just understand, maybe I'm misunderstanding your question.
Unclear? Be more clear.
So the education costs are divided throughout all of the taxpayers in the state. And so what we're saying is this funding, this extra cost now has to be borne by all of the taxpayers in the state to build this program.
No,
And so it gets spread.
nope, that's not how TIF works.
Well, how does doesn't the taxpayers of the state, including a town X that has a project, have voted to create, they each of them have voted their education budget. All of those budgets are added up, and the education, then we here set the tax rate to raise the amount that they've budgeted.
Okay.
That might change. It might be that it's determined differently, but that's money that one way or another, there is a budget for education in the state.
Right, but the increment is foregone revenue. So you're gonna pay your original taxable value in the town regardless of whether you have a TIF. If you have a TIF district, it's that additional amount, that increment that is generated from the development. So that increment wouldn't exist but for that development happening, right? I mean, you're familiar with TIFs, you understand that. So the original taxable value is going to get paid no matter what, and 30% of that increase is also going to the ed fund. But for a period of time, the town is going to take 70% of that projection, whatever that is, and pay back their bond for their infrastructure improvements. And then the whole point of this is that we're making an investment so that at the end of 20 years, the state as a whole is getting more money in the ed fund.
But in the interim, taxpayers are not paying for that increment that's being withheld by the town.
Right.
That's what I think there's a misunderstanding.
It all hinges on the but-for argument.
It is. It's
about the but-for argument, that increment would go into the ed fund and reduce everybody's taxes.
That's right.
But instead, it's not. And so it all hinges on the but-for argument, and a lot of people are concerned that, yeah, it's great, the but-for argument, but yeah, maybe but for that investment, that development wouldn't happen there, but it would happen somewhere else.
Well,
nearby. And that's the question.
Well,
It's
that's-
not an easy one.
It's the
All I'm
policy
saying
question.
is I'm a little concerned that if we're taking away taxes that would otherwise go to the ed fund, and our answer is, don't worry, but for, it gets harder and harder to make that argument as you go up the percentage tree from 70% to 100%.
Right. I think the counter to that though, is that you as a legislature have decided that, but for test is decided by VEPSI. And VEPSI is an independent board made up of 9 individuals in Vermont that make up different towns and cities throughout Vermont. And you have 2 legislative members. And those council members take great care and great caution to make decisions that they feel are going to benefit all of Vermont. And the purpose of TIF is for economic development for our entire state. And so if you are going to say that this development would have just occurred anywhere, I think it's.
Wait, I just want to interject here for a moment because, I mean, we're talking about a housing crisis. So I think it's fair to say the development is not happening. The other data point I would say is we had tax department run the average grand list growth, excluding reappraisals, but the average grand list growth over the last 15 years, and 198 towns had grand list growth, average grand list growth of less than 1%. So I think it's fair to say that building is not happening. I mean, maybe it's happening in a small cluster, but yes, is there risk of that? Perhaps. We're not going to have a zero risk-free rate on any of it, but I think to answer the housing crisis, to encourage and incentivize development, this is one tool that could be used in a builder's toolbox. And the notion that other taxpayers are paying for the increment is just incorrect. If that were the case, there wouldn't be calculations about how much is foregone on the ed fund. And even if we don't, let's say we don't believe the but for, do we think that the state has a role in incentivizing housing development?
We have several,
Emily's been waiting.
She's been waiting, yeah.
1, 2, 3. That work?
Emily's been waiting.
Okay, Emily.
On this whole thing about the 100%, is there a limit on parcel size or parcel value? Or is it just the pencil out, like whether it pencils out or not?
Are you talking about for Spark or for?
For Spark.
Yeah, so that would be up to the municipality to decide how many parcels. But I would, based on my conversations with individual towns, it's usually 1 or 2 parcels that are creating a project.
I wasn't meaning like actual like number of parcels. I mean the actual like physical geometry, the area of the parcel itself. Because from my understanding about the 100% issue is the issue that the size of the parcel or the value of the parcel is not going to give the same amount of tax revenue to be breaking out the increments. So the idea is that 100% will go back to the town, nothing goes to the ed fund.
So
is that based on the value of the parcel?
So the original taxable value of a parcel of land that value will always go back to the ed fund.
Okay.
What we're talking about is the additional amount that would be generated from the development. What we're saying is that 100%, up to 100% of that would go back to the municipality. As it does in a regular TIF, it's currently a 70-30 split. So 30% of that revenue goes to the ed fund in addition to the original value.
Over top of the original.
Yep. And then 70% goes to the municipality.
Okay.
Under Spark, up to 100% would go
back to the municipality.
But hopefully for a shorter period of time.
But that is also based on the original taxable value.
It's based on the increase
Of the
original value.
based on the increase of the value, okay, so.
But to answer the question more directly, no, we have not anticipated a size limit. Right, we're
Or
not
a
saying,
value.
yeah, or a size value. It's gonna get determined because we're gonna look at it, you're gonna see what that value is, and just like we do now in TIF, like, is there enough incremental value in the proposed project to pay back the project for infrastructure, or in this case, is it enough to incentivize the builder to say, yes, I'm gonna do this project?
Michael? Yeah, as a community that has a TIF, I just wanna make a comment about the benefits of it. When our community used the funds for the TIF, we ended up doing some remediation on brownfields within our district, and we have a nice parking spot, which is, far better than what it was before. It's a huge benefit for municipalities. Regarding the foregone funds or
Revenue.
foregone revenue, it's the TIP is not a tax stabilization. And I know for our community, we have tax stabilization and we can stabilize the ed fund. When we, as a municipality, stabilize the ed fund, everybody in that area has to pay for that amount. Whereas in TIF, that's not the case. It's just foregone revenue. Because with a stabilization, a municipality done stabilization, the ed fund still needs to collect that money. So then the surrounding folks in that community have to pay the extra money to do the ed, to get the money into the ed fund. That's not the case for a TIF. A TIF you're not getting the revenue. It's not, it's.
Right. That's a good, yeah, that's a good explanation. It's not where in a stabilization agreement, you have to make up for the rest. It's not that. It's that foregone revenue never hits the rolls, if you will. It just goes back to the municipality.
In the Spark scenario, you could actually cost the ed fund money because you're building housing. Along with housing, when people enter housing, hopefully they're bringing children, which then go into the school system of that municipality, which incurs cost. But because of the TIF that's there, that money is going back to the developer, which means that the rest of the ed fund has to pick up the extra cost to educate those kids that are in that development. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand the question. I'm just curious. I mean, everything we've heard is that the population of students has decreased steadily over the last decade. So I think it's pretty fair to say there's excess capacity, especially in the small rural towns. That I'd be hard pressed to say that this is a cost. Probably could add a lot more children.
Have you thought about, with everything that's being done on the education side, and there's a talk about block grants from the state? So the state is collecting X amount of dollars just to give out to all the towns. And it's a reverse of the town sending us the bill and the other, and so how would that affect this? Would there be an effect?
I think it would be a neutral effect because at the end of the day, all the ed tax bill is being sent to the state. So if this is foregone revenue now, it's foregone revenue, even if there's a new distribution method, because it's all going to a central spot. I don't think that's changing.
please, I'll tell you what, I think you should. I don't want to stop questions, but I think that in the interest of time, it would be good if you went through your remaining slides.
Okay, I'll give it back to Joan.
Yeah, in order to, let's say we were to successfully get through this idea of project-based TIF, Spark, what we want to do is change the TIF statute, lift the cap. Currently, there's a cap on 2 districts per county and the maximum number of TIFs that VEPSI can authorize statewide. And so the statute currently limits the creation of 6 new TIF districts. 2 are being utilized, 4 remain to be created. This new capability needs to coexist in municipalities that already have TIF districts, as an example. And so, for example, Fairhaven is a good one. Killington has a TIF district. Rutland has voiced their interest in becoming a TIF district. That would exclude Fairhaven from doing anything. That would exclude many other towns from doing anything. And so we're just wondering why there is that constraint, and could we lift that constraint so that development could occur? There was another technical change that we would be in favor of, which is the timeline of when a district, usually it begins April 1st of the year that the select board or the town management approved it. It really should be April 1st of the year that it receives VEPSI approval. And that's because sometimes it takes some time for that town to then get everything together to present to VEPSI. And that's been asked for by the development, the municipal community. These slides just go through a level of pre and post TIF, the annual education fund contribution, and gives an idea of what the impact is in terms of taxable value and ultimate contribution to the ed fund. So again, I do think this is really next generation investment.
Joan, do we have these slides on the website of the 2 committees yet?
Yes. Yeah, it's on ours.
Thank you.
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
And this is a measure of original taxable value versus current taxable value and the change. And some of them are small because they just began, some are larger. It really just depends on the size of the district. And these are some of the major differences between regular TIF and Spark. And I really think the major difference is allowing the municipality to kind of transfer the benefit of the increment to a private developer, a private builder.
Please.
Joan, I'm wondering if we can step back 2 slides. You began with the record of success for the education fund contribution. It seems like it's an important, I just want to make sure I understand this. Since TIF districts are active for several years, what is pre-TIF versus post-TIF? Is the entire time the TIF's activity in Winooski being jumped over, or help me understand?
Yeah, so I think pre-TIF is before the commencement of the TIF district, what they're contributing to the ed fund. Post-TIF is after the retention period ends. Do I have that right, Jessica? I don't know.
Yeah, that's right. So pre-TIF
Okay.
is the original taxable value. So for Winooski, for example, their original taxable value before their TIF district was created, they were contributing $516,000 to the ed fund. The retention period for Winooski just ended in 2024. Their TIF district is now closed. Those same parcels of land will now contribute $2.2 million to the ed fund.
Are the other ones projections?
Yes.
That's what I'm trying to get at.
Those are projections. So is the Milton Town, this is important, it's an interesting table. Is the Milton Town core 2.9 million? That's a projection of the taxes that it will produce.
Yes.
Are those nominal dollars, or do they take into account inflation?
So that's a great question. And the deputy commissioner and I were just talking about that. Joan, do you have an answer to that?
I think they're nominal, because I
I
think.
think they're nominal as
Yeah,
well.
I don't think they
Yeah.
did, yeah.
Yeah,
So, you know, it would be, given the controversy,
I agree.
given the nature of the controversy, I'd love to see this chart somehow inflation adjusted.
Yeah.
I still think it would yield similarly positive results.
Well-
It's, your question is very timely because I was having that conversation with the deputy commissioner at 11 o'clock this morning.
I don't know if it's the inflation rate or whether it's the grand list growth rate that you'd want to look at, right? Because if we have an average of 1%. Yeah.
I think even with inflation, still have a positive.
I would appreciate more clarity on this chart for sure.
Yeah.
Other questions before, go ahead, please.
Question about the recommendation to lift the cap, which is currently 2 TIFs per county. Do you have a new cap figure in mind, or would that be, because obviously there is at least a freezing effect on the affected properties' contribution to the ed fund? Do you have any guidance of what you would like to see for a cap for the number of projects?
I don't think they want a cap.
No, we don't.
Don't want any cap whatsoever?
No.
Okay.
Maybe we start instilling caps when we feel that we've got ample housing for our citizens and ample opportunities, but I don't think we're there yet. If anyone here feels that we would achieve those levels of education fund contribution by doing nothing, yeah, that's an interesting argument.
Anything else? You have.
That's it. That's it on the slideshow.
Should we just ask council? Mr. Gray, would you like to come and testify? Thank you so
You're welcome.
much.
And I
Please
think-
don't leave the room.
I won't either. You haven't scared me away. And I do think that after hearing testimony yesterday in Rep. Marcotte's committee, I believe that you have the 2023 TIF program annual report that's been sent to you. The new annual report will be available as of April 1st. And I'm happy to continue to answer questions as this committee works through these issues.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Joan, also, thank you so much for your testimony and your responses to our various questions.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Hello?
State your name for the record, John.
Yes.
Take it away.
John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. So I will admit to being confused sitting down, but I think that there's probably a happy explanation for my confusion, which is the reactions that I have to this proposal are based on the administration's proposed language, which I think there's some gap between the language and the presentation we heard today. So I'm hopeful that it's just that the language doesn't match up with what was expressed, and that we can resolve that. But just to point out, I don't see any requirement for a rebate component to the administration proposed language. You could provide, as currently drafted, dollars from day one to the project. But I'm happy to talk through my sets of reactions to this proposal, or if you guys just want to throw questions to me and I can respond to how I think about the current language. I would say my main takeaway thus far has just been that it would be extremely helpful for me to talk to the drafter of the administration proposed language, because it feels different from the presentation.
Let's acknowledge at the outset that this is a little unusual in that we don't have a bill. We don't have an actual bill in front of us. And we're all working off of a draft, which was called, I believe, and I just want to identify it. It was a draft that was presented to the House General and Housing Committee by the administration, and it was called Draft 6. And we understand that that's an evolving document and that the bill It's not yet been presented, but the advantage of our proceeding anyway is we get a head start. And if things improve or change, fine, we can deal with them. So my feeling is it would be fine for him to give his reaction to draft 6. With the understanding that it may change,
Sounds good.
or it may have changed already in somebody's minds.
I would say it sounds like it has already changed, or what I think is also just possible is that the intent was not reflected in the language, and I can talk to some of that as well, because I think one of the big pieces I took away from this presentation was how much hinges on the community agreements. It's one of the things about which I had the most questions. But just to start, my first reaction was something that you guys have already talked about. I think has already been addressed, but that's the significant change in the definition of improvements, which are those pieces that can be funded with that increment. Previously, we were just talking about public infrastructure with the hope that it would incentivize or produce further development within a district. So you're probably going to hear me compare a lot during this between what's on the books for TIF districts and what the Spark proposal is. I think that's a nice way to think about what this proposal does and to try to draw out some of the differences in functional safeguards, I would say, between the two. So this proposal allows for outright development with those dollars. So the increment can go directly to a housing development. It doesn't have to just be to the infrastructure that would then produce that. And that could be public dollars outright flowing to a private developer. We heard earlier discussion about selling back infrastructure that has been built by a private developer to the city or to a municipality. I would say that currently as drafted, there's nothing that requires that sale to occur. I'm guessing, again, this would be something that's subject to that community agreement, but as currently drafted, you could just be sending public dollars to a private development that never goes back to, it could be private infrastructure essentially. So that brings me to kind of my biggest point here, which is just how much hangs on the community agreement piece, and to call out the pieces that are picked up throughout the draft. Related costs may include direct payments consistent with the community agreement. Without knowing what the community agreement is, it's hard to say what the extent of those related costs are. I will qualify that by saying related costs are limited in the sense that they do have to be directly related to the TIF. So it's not as if you could just create a community agreement, fill out a bunch of things that have nothing to do with the TIF and have those funded. There are constraints in place to ensure the related costs are related to the project. But I do just want to call out that the community agreement is shaping a lot of the standards for what would be in place for this proposal. Additionally, VEPC is authorized to approve Spark projects to provide financing to a community investment partner consistent with the community agreement. So again, just calling out places where I think a lot is hinging on what's basically a one-line definition, what that community agreement is. And there's no, at least currently, there are no substantive standards for what that community agreement would be. I think what we've heard is that that would essentially be left to the contracting process, right? That the municipality, although it wouldn't be the public that's voting on the community agreement. The way that it works is it's approved by the legislative body of the municipality. So that would be the folks representing a board or mayor, or whoever it might be. So the community agreement that's governing how this project might go is negotiated between, at least as currently drafted, that legislative body for the municipality and then the community investment partner. And that's going to be quite determinative of how these projects run. So I just want to call out how loose that feels. You could see lots of things happening in that space, and it leaves a lot to the contracting process is, I think, the best way to put it. So I would ask, what constraints might you envision being put on the community agreement? And I would ask too, because it requires approval of the legislative body, but we're also envisioning this community agreement being contracted between a muni and a community investment partner. Is that approval process separate from the contracting process? Wouldn't the contracting between the muni and the community investment partner constitute that approval? So I just wonder how many checks are actually in place for the community agreement. Another thing I would note is that standard TIFs, big TIFs, what's currently on the books, include a requirement that financing for improvements be authorized by voters. That specific line is included in the definition of financing. That may be intended to be implicit in this draft, but that particular clause has dropped from the Spark proposal. And so the concern that raises for me is conceivably, you could pick up any debt that the municipality elects to pay for improvements in the approved Spark site project. So it's going to that approved project that's gone through this whole process that's envisioned in the bill. But you could have additional financing for those same improvements in that space, and they wouldn't have to go through this process because the definition of financing doesn't include that clause related to authorized by the voters. So I just wonder if there are kind of loose pieces here that allow other funds to end up going through this process, but outside the safeguards that are meant to be provided here. I would also note that there's a lack of.
Can I ask you to slow down on that one?
Yes.
I'm just not sure I understood.
Sure.
Maybe I'm the only one who's stupid, but I feel a little over my head on this one.
No, you're good.
Just go back a little slower.
Yep. So when we think about in big TIFs, just the broad definition of financing, so kind of a key piece here that we're thinking about increments going to. As part of that requirement, there are only specified pieces that money can go to. So it has to be bonds that have been approved by the voters related to the project. I'm just calling out that particular clause about authorization by the voters is not present in the Spark proposal. And so conceivably, and like I said, it's possible to me that this was just an omission and not an intentional thing, but it's conceivable to me that without that clause, a crafty municipality could decide outside of the Spark proposal to bond. And so, the voters have said we want to bond for this. So maybe they have their own processes for ensuring that there's sufficient public support for this. But they could not have that bond go through the Spark process. Basically, this would be additional funding outside of the safeguards provided here, but it would also be funded by the increment that's done through this. So I'm just calling out that as drafted, I think you could have dollars coming from outside even the Spark process. And I just wonder if that's been thought about, if that's intentional. It could easily just be an unintentional omission, but we have that clause in TIF district definition of financing, and it's omitted here. So that's really what I'm drawing out, is just that one particular clause is missing, and I wonder what that means.
I think I understood what you said, but I'm wondering about, I guess I'd like to explore one thing that's related to that. In the status quo, as I understand it, there's always two options. The increment can be spent on a pay-as-you-go basis. You don't have to bond the increment. You could spend it as it comes in, though I imagine that's not usually the case. Usually you go the other route, you bond, correct?
I honestly, I can't speak to, I think other folks in the room would better be able to speak to.
Saying it right. Usually people don't use the money on a pay-as-you-go basis. They bond because they want the upfront money.
That's correct.
Okay. So if a town wants to bond under this current state of affairs, they have to vote to approve the bond. If they didn't want to bond, if they wanted to just pay as you go, there wouldn't be a vote, would there? Or would, no, okay. So there wouldn't be a
It would
vote.
go through the only vote would be through their local legislative body.
Right, okay. Rare, I admit, rare, but, okay. Under Spark actually contemplates a sort of pay-as-you-go situation. It's not necessarily the one but the example of the racetrack, for example, there's no bonds, right? So would there be a vote?
There would need to be a vote because you would not be bonding. It would go through the municipal, the select board.
Right. So I do think you have at least triggered in my mind another situation where this is different. In other words, you almost always under normal TIFs, I'm not saying this is bad, I'm just trying to understand it. Almost always in normal TIFs, you're issuing bonds, tax exempt bonds to pay for infrastructure, and the town has to vote. If you if you have a situation where you're not going to issue bonds, there's no provision in this law, in the proposed law, Spark, for any kind of town vote. It's up to the elected officials. Okay. I'm not totally wrong on this. Okay, go ahead, John.
Sure. So appreciate that. And I think, some of what this may get at too is the extent to which particular pieces of TIF administration, both currently and to be seen, are addressed through rulemaking, because obviously Pepsi has authority to pass rulemaking in this space. And so I know that earlier there was discussion about substantial changes, provisions related to substantial changes, which may be addressed through Pepsi rulemaking or other provisions. It's not clear to me if the existing Pepsi rules would apply to this. This is not a TIF district. This is a Spark. So this is something entirely distinct. And there's a couple of things that make me wonder in this area. So I talked about how you might have money that's routed outside of the safeguards of this process that could make its way to the increment, at least as currently financing is defined. The way you would typically in a TIF district have a safeguard to pick that up, if you didn't have the clause that I'm talking about, is through the substantial change piece. You would say, well, the voters have to vote on this piece because they're making a change to this proposal. I don't see a substantial change provision in the proposed draft. But perhaps there will be rulemaking in this space. So it's just something to think about. I'm trying to get at things where I could see people circumventing the constraints of the proposed language, basically. Another point I would make, and I realize I'm just kind of hitting different pieces of the bill, concerns that are occurred to me. Typically, a TIF can include, as part of its bonding, funds to cover debt service interest payments for a 2-year period. At least the conceptual justification I think of as why you might want to do this is that you may not have generated additional value in that first 2 years of a project, right? Like it's in the development stage, so you aren't receiving sufficient funding, but you still want to be able to cover those financing costs. In this case, there's no time constraint on this piece. There's no 2-year limit on applying TIF to those interest payments. You could include as part of your community agreement that you're going to cover interest payments for the lifetime of the bond. Economically, that sounds odd to me, but I just wanted to point out.
Capitalized interest payment.
Yes. One of the...
So do I understand correctly? A capitalized interest payment. Just in general financing, what you're doing is you're protecting yourself by borrowing enough money. So you borrow enough money to do whatever project you're doing, and you promise to pay it back. If you add on to the amount you borrow, you add on enough so that if something really goes south, you've got 2 years of interest covered. Literally, you stick it back in your pocket and use it to pay that interest. And here you're saying it could be more.
It could be more. It's just interesting because obviously you're paying interest on having
interest.
Exactly.
Yeah.
One of the key questions I have for the draft is what is a Spark site? In any kind of TIF concept, you need a defined geographic area in which to assign your original taxable value. And you need to say that this is the area in which the rules apply. This is where development is happening. You need to specify. I think I sort of generally understand the concept here. A Spark site is meant to be a project or envisioned development and adjoining parcels. But it's a question to me what the limit of adjoining parcels is. And I would also just note that the definition of Spark site speaks to approved development and redevelopment. Is that reference to development to the project that the voters have said we want to do this thing? Or is it a reference to the development that is expected to occur as a result of the project? Depending on those constraints, you could end up with a quite differently sized Spark site. And I think it's really important to know what the size of the Spark site is going to be, even just from a functional perspective. I'm guessing this is something where people have a clear answer, but it's not clear from the draft to me what a Spark site actually is, and we need to know that. I would also note that, just 1 second. the definition of original taxable value is set based on the Spark site plus adjoining parcels. So technically that would mean development plus adjoining parcels around that. And I just don't know where it ends. So I am guessing this is just imprecise drafting, but I wondered if there could be some accidental bleed through and you basically don't know what the scope of the Spark site is, in which case you wouldn't be able to determine an original taxable value and you couldn't run the project at all. Couple of simple things that should be live for many of you after some of Ted's presentation. Under current TIF law, there are particular location criteria that a project is intended to meet. You have to meet 3 out of 5 of those for what's on the books. This proposal says to meet only 1 of 6 criteria, so I just want to call out the loosening of that location constraint. And I would note that the final location criterion that is envisioned here is much like what's on the books for a transportation type location criteria, so improving transportation in a particular area. But it modifies that transportation area criterion in a pretty significant way to include recreational development and trail systems. That's fine if that's the direction that you guys would like to head. I would just call out that when Ted was giving his presentation before, he was talking about how TIFs, even if you put aside potential economic benefits, or one of the arguments you could make for why TIFs might be justifiable in the absence even of economic benefits would be that they direct development toward particular areas. I just want to note that with the softening of this transportation criterion, the changes to some of the location criteria, I think that connection between targeted development and location criteria is now more tenuous, is what I would say. We heard earlier, and this is a key one, about the but-for. So the but-for is the key piece here that lets us know whether or not additional dollars are just being created, and this is a win-win for everyone. If you imagine property, your taxes aren't going to go up sufficiently, your growth in your district resulting from the TIF or Spark is sufficient to increase revenues over time, then you can imagine that the TIF is economically justifiable. But we talked about, and I think in particular, Ramahala, you had pointed out that really rides on how substantive that but-for criterion is. If it's weak, then we can't necessarily say that you've produced additional dollars and you may actually be siphoning off money. So the point I wanted to get at in this draft is the but-for criterion here is different. Typically, we think about the review criteria for this piece as getting at how a project would proceed differently and more poorly in the absence of the project, right? It might increase the size of affordable housing through the increment, or you might more quickly be able to proceed toward this project. There's still pieces of that but-for criterion maintained here. I don't want to mislead you and say that it's totally transformed, but there's a new review piece added related to a documented need for housing in an area. And I would just call out, if you're including this in your but-for criterion, I think you've weakened the but-for. And as we can imagine, most regions of the state, if not all regions of the state, have a diagnosed need for housing. So I just want to call out that change to the but-for review is one you should think about. And another piece that I would note is that for big TIFs, there's a set of, in addition to location criteria, which we just talked about in brief, there are also process requirements required. So you need to have held public hearings. You need to have provided information to voters. And there's all sorts of things that you need to do. And there are process checks. BEPC looks and says, did you hold hearings? Did you come up with a financing plan and the like? Part of the financing plan that you have to provide for big TIFs, in that financing plan, you have to provide a demonstration that the project would not proceed without the allocation of a tax increment. That's a but-for demonstration. There is no such requirement in the financing plan for the Spark proposal. Another piece I would, I'm sorry.
Are you referring to a document that you have?
The omnibus housing proposal is out there. I am not sure where it is.
It's on our website. You have the omnibus housing proposal. I think those are your prepared notes that are.
Oh yeah, these are just my notes. Yep.
All right. But you mentioned the version 6 draft.
It says at the top.
That's the one that you shouldn't be on
Yeah,
your.
that should be, I think that's all that's out there right now. This version, it says up at the top, versions Roman 6. Does it say that on your?
Oh, is that a VI? I thought
That's like, it's Roman.
Okay, draft, yeah.
Roman 6.
Got it.
For what it's worth, I read it the same way as you, and I have just been going along with this version. Yes.
Thanks very much for your presentation. I don't have version 6 in front of me, so, but I appreciate the thoughts here. What I'm hearing is a lot of legitimate questions about some general skepticism around the whole what-for analysis. And I'm not aware, I'm not aware of all the things that are going on in terms of housing. But I do want to point out that some of these rural districts are really hurting. They're not even maintaining their existing housing stock, much less increasing it at the level that folks say we need in these towns. So if this isn't going to be a vehicle, I sure hope that there are other vehicles, because these towns are really, really hurting. And they need the support of the state to increase their housing stock so it can remain viable. If this isn't the vehicle, so be it. But I really strongly believe in this.
John, we're kind of running out of time. Do you have anything else you want to say before? I want to leave at least a little time for Ed.
I'm sorry to, yeah. I can give some just very quick points and then if people want to follow up with me. For big TIFs, there's a proportionality constraint in place, which means that the municipal legislative body can commit increments for the financing of improvements and related costs only in the same proportion by which the improvement or related costs serve the districts as determined by the council. So that's a determination that VEPC makes. That constrains how much that increment is, right? There's no proportionality constraint for the SPARK proposal. Unspecified indebtedness against revenues of what? Typically it's against revenues of the district. Here we don't know what revenues it's against. Is it just the SPARK site or is it the municipality broadly? I'm guessing it would make sense for it to be the SPARK site. That's the increment that you're generating, but just wanting to note. There's no requirement for VEPC to approve a financing plan prior to a public vote on a bond like there is for normal TIFs. I think pretty big piece. That means that typically there's been some check before the bond vote happens for a municipality. The debt incurrence period here is 5 plus a discretionary 3-year period. You can think of that as maybe lighter than typical TIFs, which are likely to hit that 10-year period. But I would just note that could become an automatic 8-year debt incurrence period. We've already you guys have talked about the 100% retention of increment and clarified that it's up to 100% for at least the education property tax period. The other piece I think is important to note here is there's no specified retention period.
There's no
specified retention period. We think about a 20-year retention period for TIF districts. There's no retention period here. It hinges on the length of financing. So conceivably, a municipality could, through the way it structures its financing, have quite a long retention
period.
period.
Hinge on the financing, or is it simply whatever's in the agreement?
They could do this through the agreement, but the way that I read it is that upon retirement of the debt, that's when the retention period would
But
end.
there's no debt?
If there's no debt, it's a question.
There's no debt in the racetrack. Okay. So there's no specified period for payback. Right, okay.
Which I think gets also to whether you're advantaging or siphoning from the ed fund, because depending on the length of that period, you could have different effects. Lastly, there's no annual reporting to the legislature. Information reporting may be weaker because at least a portion of it is governed by the community agreement, about which we don't know much. And this dispute resolution pieces of this are absent, I would say. In the bigger TIF context, there are required hearings. VEPC has less power. The Secretary of Commerce and Community Development makes certain determinations. There's no appeal under the SPARK proposal, no referral to the AG in the event of bad happenings. Presumably they could still do this, but they aren't authorized by SPARK to do this. and no specified withholding of funds in the event that a municipality doesn't pay its underpayments to the ed fund. So I just want to call out that the dispute resolution pieces of the Spark proposal are much lighter than what's in place for big TIFs. And I pointed out earlier that Spark is not a TIF district, so you would not need to remove the caps to make Spark happen. Spark would not be subject to the TIF caps.
Yes, thank you very much. And
Yes.
don't you have a few minutes? And I think if people have questions, which I bet they will, I think they should direct them perhaps to the chairs and then we will take them to John.
We have them all coming back.
Oh, good. All right. Good.
For the record, Ted Barnett, Joint Fiscal Office. I am going to share my screen. I have some notes that just help me organize my thoughts, and they should be on the committee pages. I am going to, John raised a lot of technical and substantial concerns. I'm going to zoom out and talk a little bit more about the current state of the Ed Fund, current rates of growth, and talk about how Sparks might intersect with that. At a very broad level, JFO is unable to provide a fiscal estimate. I think a lot of the concerns that John brought up preclude us from having enough information to be able to provide potential, a formal estimate of cost to the statewide education fund, especially considering this up to 100% retention of education fund increment. So yes, we would need more information about the scope, size, intended magnitude of the Spark program to really start to understand some of the fiscal ramifications. I would like to say that statewide grand list growth is currently high. There may be some distinction between what is happening at local municipal grand lists and what is happening on the statewide education grand list. So in fiscal year 24, actual statewide average grand list growth was 9.7% and is forecasted to be at least 14%. It's 14.3% in fiscal year 25 and 14.7% in fiscal year 26. And this is from the most recent education fund outlook that was presented to the e-board in January. In use through this but-for of TIF, conceptually speaking, is predicated on a declining or stagnant grand list, which, based on the data I've seen using the equalized education grand list, that's not likely to be the case for much of Vermont.
And is that because the value of real estate keeps going up? So it's not inconsistent with the fact that we aren't seeing new real estate.
Exactly. There are three pieces, right? When thinking about what's contributing value to the education fund, you have new construction, rehabilitation, and then this background growth are houses that haven't changed in any way. They're selling for higher prices. And so there's an accounting for that growth in value. So looking at, I just took using information that's available from Property Valuation Review, looking at the difference between the equalized value on the 2023 grand list and the equalized value in the 2024 grand list. 161 towns were seeing growth of at least, so they were seeing growth between 10 and 20%. And you only had 2 towns that had a declining grand list. One of them I would note is Somerset, population 6, it's near Dover in southern Vermont. So when you freeze values in this context, vacant land, things in municipality could grow, are likely growing, many of them are, at double-digit background growth rates. And that would get captured by the Spark district and not remitted to the education fund. And so that's the conversation about where our foregone revenue is coming from. There's also a piece that I wanted to mention very quickly that research conducted in other states have found that areas with higher property value growth are more likely to implement a TIF. This could be because they want to capture and retain that value as opposed to remitting it to other jurisdictions to provide infrastructure projects within their locality. And so if that's a mechanism that's happening with Sparks, or Spark sites, that could be a further risk to the education fund.
So you're saying that if you create a Spark district, you do capture the increased value that comes from the project, but you also capture the increased value. I mean, if it's just project specific, if there's nothing there to begin with, you're not capturing the increased value of the increase in value because there's no increase in there's nothing there to increase.
Well, there may, for a vacant piece of land, for example, that value is increasing along with the cost of vacant
land.
Yeah,
You're
it's just
capturing the increased vacant land value. And if there's something there, you're improving it, you're capturing its inflationary increase.
that as well, exactly. And, it's, as John mentioned, unclear what the size of the Spark site. So it may just be project specific, but if you're incorporating 8 to 10 parcels that include current housing or things that are already there, those would be appreciating in value as well. And that would be captured upon creating the Spark site. John did go through to the difference in criteria between Spark projects and the TIF program. So I will share that I do agree that the advantage of driving development to dense downtowns would be lost in the current Spark proposal. Yes, and I think there was earlier discussion around risk. And if there is bonding that happens up front and you have a very narrow Spark site that relies on development to generate increment, if you've gone to bond, you're certainly creating risk and you don't have other ways. Smaller towns, unlike larger ones, may not have other sources of revenue to mitigate that risk. So they're really on their own and relying on that development. And if the municipality is the one that's doing the bonding, they're the ones who are on the hook. So in that specific case, there could be risk there from a fiscal standpoint. The same thing is within the big TIF program, we've just made it through COVID. I'd also want to flag that there's often uncertainty with construction projects. They often incur delays, and that's also a piece of risk if municipalities have bonded and the project is delayed by a couple of years. And there isn't increment to pay for bond payments. I will skip the piece around disparities and equity in use because that was covered quite a bit earlier testimony. I would like to also highlight John's point about the indefinite length of the retention period. With longer retention periods, the bonding period may be longer, which results in using more expensive instruments, meaning that the interest rate may be higher over a longer term. And in which case, there would need to be more education fund increment to pay for those additional costs. I did want to flag one of the considerations I thought of when looking at this is that with the developer agreements, there could be an incentive for a housing developer to go to many different municipalities and essentially shop around to find the best deal on an agreement. And so that is also something to consider in this proposal.
I think we can, if it's okay with the committee, our committee has floor at 3. We all have floor. What am I saying? We've had House Senate doing here. Okay. Anyway, let's go to 5 of 3. Think we can.
So
we can hustle. Okay. All right.
And I am naturally a very quick talker, and I will try and hit the upper bound of that without it's like a word salad, but I wanted to leave with more general questions about thinking through the need for infrastructure development and housing in the state. I worked on a JFO report that talked about the difficulties of financing public infrastructure in Vermont. The challenges are very real, and wanted to flag where would this proposed policy fit in the municipal toolkit? So for example, comparing against a revolving loan program, which is proposed to be funded in this housing bill, would have a clear fiscal impact because the fiscal impact would be the amount of money, in this case, general fund, that's put into the fund. We know the constraints on what that funding costs to the state. Also, we are following, if you're thinking about this tool as a mechanism for infrastructure development, we've just made it through a period where there's been a lot of COVID and infrastructure funding that has flowed through the system. Of the projects that are remaining that towns haven't gotten to, how many are feasible from a technical standpoint or from a political economy standpoint? So do the voters actually want them? There's a real concern that something like Weston was a town that was ready to put in a water system and most of it was paid for except for a $400,000 contingency bond, and the voters decided the project wasn't right for them. So there's a tension between the political economy and what agreement might be negotiated between legislative leaders and a developer. And then if it's more that the concern is that developer costs don't pencil out, why, I would just pose the question, why is the education fund the one that would provide these dollars? Should the state be an investor of education fund dollars if the benefits aren't accruing in the short term, given the uncertainty with the statewide education fund at this juncture? And are there other tools available that we could consider?
You know what, we're talking about, what we're talking about here is the possibility of more joint hearings on this. And I think we're talking about next Tuesday, a joint hearing. Does that work on our schedule as well? So what I guess I'm going to say, Ted, is we'll be able to concentrate better and hear you more. And I know there was at least one question for you. And what we should do is just continue this next Tuesday afternoon, if that's all right. Both with you and you guys on that committee, both committees will deal with this more on Tuesday afternoon.
And everybody, this is all on both our web pages. So committees, I think members take a look at, this is what Ed is actually talking from. So take a look at that and then we can ask, we'll have much more time to ask questions on Tuesday. And then Jess, I'm hoping, I don't know, I don't think Anna Grace has sent the invite out yet, but you can touch base with Joan as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to come back.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Yeah. All right. So anything else? I've been instructed and trained that I can't see the A word as in, I can't say that word until we really are. Is there anything else that anyone wants to say while we're still on video? Yes.
I would just like to ask, where is this racetrack? Is this the Devil's Bowl?
No, it's in Fairhaven.
Yeah,
The original.